Hello everyone, welcome to a programming tutorial today in Visual Basic. We're going to be working in Microsoft Visual Studio for this, however you can use any integrated development environment that you want. We're going to be making a random number generator. Now this can be used in pretty much any game system that you want. However, you wouldn't necessarily use Visual Basic to program the game, but the same principles would apply if you were using a game such as, a game engine such as Unity, which would be using C# or Java, and you can convert this to C# if you know how to do that. But the same general structure does apply to other programming languages in which you can make games. However, we're just going to be using a console application today. I've got two windows open here. I've got this program here that I've already written, just so I can have a baseline, so that I can, because everyone who does programming, you kind of you do something different mostly every single time you do it. It's like I've made a random string generator a few times now, and I can tell you that this one is completely different to the one I made last time. Mainly due to the fact that this one only creates numbers. However, we can manipulate this to make strings as well. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going through each one of these lines, basically from line 1 to 15. This is about as small as I can think of making it, including like these console write lines, just for adding like a bit of detail to it. I'm just going to be going through everything that's going on here. It's not very difficult if you look at it, and basically what we're starting off with here is obviously we have our module and sub main. So this is obviously the sub procedure that's main. We're not going to be making any other sub procedures today. We don't need to. You can if you want. And obviously here we have sub main and then sub here, and it just makes it for you when you create a new project in Visual Basic. It just creates a new sub procedure for you. You don't have to mess around with that yet. So when in Visual Basic, if you want to create something called a variable, now if you're new to programming, variables are a type of data that can be changed around in the program while it is running. Now we have something here called a random. In fact, I'm going to skip that for now, and I'm going to go to this class here called an integer. Now from maths, you probably should know that an integer is a whole number that can be minus, it could be 0, and it could also be obviously positive. Now this does not include decimal points, so it can be any number up to some, like, as a couple of million numbers that you can have as integers, and that's limited to RAM. And you can look that up if you need to. However, we won't be going anywhere near that number today, and what I've done here is I have declared this variable using dim, and this creates a dimension. This is what you have to do in Visual Basic. And then in fact, just to make it easier, I will move this here just to make it a bit more readable. So what this does here is it creates a variable called random integer. Now this is what we're going to be using to generate the random number, and you can see it written here, and we'll get to this part in a minute. And you have to basically tell Visual Basic what type of variable you want to call it, and I'm calling this obviously an integer because it needs to be an integer. Here we basically have the same thing. It's still an integer, but this is the length of the string. Well, this is actually a load of characters, numbers, sorry. This is the length of the generated number string, you could call it. That's the length of it that you can specify. And what we'll see what we're doing with that later on. Here we have the generated number that's going to come out of the random generator, which is basically that. That is the random number generator. Well, you include that as well. And I'm just converting that to a string immediately, because a string can be a series of characters, letters, numbers, or symbols. And just to keep stuff on the safe side, I'm not going to turn this all into an integer, because I can't use this function if I turn that into an integer. So I'm just keeping it as a string, because strings, you can use numbers in them. This is a console.write line. It basically writes to the console this text here. and we'll get to that in a minute. Length basically will this is the variable we declared here, and this will take the value of length, which you will type after this line has appeared, because this is going to ask you for the length, and then you're going to type the length in, and you're going to press enter, and that's going to stick length into this variable so that you can use this variable. So what we're going to do now is, before we get onto this part, we're going to just type all this in so that I can show you how to do it. So if we dim the random, in fact I didn't explain about this one, this is a random class, and you have to declare this in order to use random numbers. Now I'm not going to get too into this, but in order to have any random numbers in a programming script, you have to have this in, and you can just stick it at the top. So we're going to say that as new random, and you put brackets in the end. And we're also going to dim a random int, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, if you want, you can add length into this. And because length and random int are the same data type, you can stick them into one dimension, and they're both integers. So you can basically shorten your code by doing this. And I thought that earlier I would just split it out into this so I could show you what that means. But you can do this as well. Now what we're going to do is we're going to dim the generated string, just because we need it later on when we actually make it, and we can just dim that as a string. Now what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user, God, I cannot type today, for the length of the string. So we're just going to type in, please enter the length. Just put that in there, and a space, just so they can type it in. In fact, you won't need that space because you're going to type it on a new line anyway. And because we've declared length here, as I said earlier, we now need to ask for it. So what that will do is it will ask for the it will take the value of length, which you'll type in here, and it will take it as a read line, and console.readline basically takes in what you've just typed in on a new line, because it will create a new line for you, and you type it in, and then that will value whatever you typed in to that line as length. So this is when it gets difficult, or when it can get difficult. If you understand the basics of these, they're called for loops, then it's not too difficult. Well, basically, what's happening here is we have something called a for loop, which will loop something until this value here equals length. Now, in programming, 0 is the first number, and you don't use 1. Because 0 is basically, if you think about it, 0 is 1, 1 is 2, 2 is 3. It's all like that, because you can use zeros in programming, because obviously computers work in binary. So what this is doing here is we have a timer that's called I, and what will happen to I every single loop of this? It will increase by 1, and the amount of times that this will increase is dependent on this number. Now, if we typed in, let's say 5, this loop here will run 6 times, if I'm getting that right, because you're going from 0. So this, you'd run this 0 times, and then you'd run it once. If you know what I mean by 0 times, it's basically the first time you run it, which the computer thinks is 0. If you turn that to 1, it would only run 5 times. If you turn it to 2, it would turn 4 times, 3, and etc. like that. But we're starting on 0 just to keep everything decent. And you should also start these for loops as 0, unless otherwise you need to. So that basically will run for, if you typed in 5, it will run for 6 times, and the actual length of the generated number will be 6 characters long. So that's what this is doing, and the parameter for the for loop is determined by length. Now you can type anything in here. You could say 1 to 10, and it will run for 11 times, or if you wanted to do 10 times, you do 0 to 9. But we're calling it length because there's a reason for this. Because what we're doing in this next line is we are creating a random integer every single time this loop is running, and that's using the we're basically saying that this random int that we declared here is equal to this random class here, and what next does is it will generate a random number using a seed that's in Visual Basic, and that random number will be between 0 and 9. Because obviously we don't want 10, because that would be 1 and 0, and that would just, it wouldn't work. So you only, if you want to create 10, if the random number generator is going to create 10, it's going to have to generate a 1, and it's going to have to generate a 0. And that might not happen. It depends on what the random generator does. So we're creating a random number every single loop of this for loop that is between 0 and 9 every single time. Now this doesn't work in the same way as this loop here. Now when you do, like, for example, when I said here you have to start on 0, this actually means 0. Like if I typed in 1, it wouldn't ever generate any zeros, it would just generate 1 to 9s. So we're doing 0 because you might want some zeros in there, because it's a number, so you're going to want zeros in there, unless you don't want zeros in there. Now this next line, basically the generated number is a string that we declared here, and what that's going to do is every single loop, so this is going to happen if we typed in 5, obviously it would happen 6 times. This generated number will be assigned the generated number, which on the first run of the loop it will be nothing. So what will happen is it will concatenate, because this is what string.concatenate, and concatenate means that you join 2 strings together. So every single loop it will join 2 strings together, it will get generated number, which at the first loop is nothing, and it will add the random integer that you generated. So if, for example, this loop on the first run of the loop it generated 7, generated number on the first loop would equal 7. So if you wrote this in a trace table, the first if you loop number 1, or loop number 0 technically, the value of generated number you would put down as, if it generated 7, you would write 7, because that was what it would be. If it then, because obviously after this has happened, it does next, so it goes back up to this for loop, and then this increments by 1. So I would now be incremented by 1, which means it will go up by 1, because it's already done one loop. So what will happen is this will happen again. It will generate a new random number between whatever you've put in here. For example, for us, we've put 0 to 9, so it will generate a new number between 0 to 9, and then it will get generated number, which was 7 now, because we've already put a value to it, and we're going to concatenate generated number, so we're going to have 7 here, and then we're going to have the new random number here. So if, for example, it generated 1, generated number now after this line was written would be 7, 1. Now if we wrote the length equal to 2, the outputted generated number would equal 72 right there. However, if we typed in 5, this would happen another, well, it would happen in total 6 times. So that's what's happening here. So we're going to now write that so that we can basically recap it. So we're going to do for I equals 0 to the length which we declared here, and we're going to do that so it writes the next in for you, because it will moan at you if it don't. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use the random integer variable that we declared, and we're going to take the random class, and we're going to create a new random number between 0 and 9. And that's all it will do. It will just generate a new random number between 0 and 9. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take generated number, which, like I said at the start, is going to equal nothing, and we're going to concatenate that. So we're going to do string.concat, get that, and then we're going to take generated number, which is nothing, number, sorry, not string, which we have, wait, hang on a minute, oh, no, it's not generated number. That's the, wait, hang on a minute. Ah, yeah, I see. So that would be, yeah, so we're calling it string in this. My bad, we're calling it string. So this is only going to generate numbers, but we're calling it string on this one, so it's going to be slightly different to this one, but the overall outcome of it is going to be completely different. And then adding on to the generated string every single loop, we're going to add the random integer that we generated here, because we've equaled it to a new random number. And that's just going to repeat however many times we put into length. And then what we're going to do is we're going to console.write, and I'm just going to literally take generated number, because after this loop has ran, it will go straight onto this line, and it's just going to output the generated string which we've made here. And then what I'm also going to put here is console.read. Now this is really good practice, because what will happen if you don't do this is it will do all of this, because obviously modern computers can do this in a matter of nanoseconds pretty much, and it will just exit. If you put this here, it will basically make you press enter before it will actually exit, so that you can actually read your string that you've generated and before it just exits. Because if you don't put this, it will just go, and you'll see like a brief appearance of it, if that, and then it will just exit the program. So it's always good to put this at the bottom of your programs whenever you make them. Now what should happen is if I press start, it should create a should, he says. Okay, let's run it from here then. Sorry. There we go. Right. So I don't quite know what I've done there. Okay, right. So this is the basically it's a copy of this. I think something's going weird because I've got two windows open, and I don't think Visual Basic likes that. But that's fine. So this you can think of is exactly the same as this, because I've just ran it from there. So if we go onto here, now what it's asking me to do is it's going to generate, it's going to dim all of these, and now the first thing it's going to ask me is going to ask me for the length of the random number. So let's generate a random number with length of 6. Now what it's generated is a random number with a length of 7. I knew that would happen, so what we need to do is we need to change this to a 1. Because actually, if you do type in 7 here, it will run for 6 times, I do believe. Which is really weird, actually. I don't know why it's doing that. So if we type in 1 and do 7. Okay, now it's doing 7, so that's what you have to do. You type in 1 to length. I don't quite know why that's happening. Okay, so if I type in 10, that should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that is 10 characters long. And that's basically what you do for this random string, number generator. The next tutorial will probably be for making random strings. And I'm also going to look into why this is equal to 1, because yeah, that is rather strange. There's probably a reason for it. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.